The paw lands on the dog's back like a question, heavy, tentative, the size of a dinner plate. Retractable claws half extended, not threatening, not quite trusting either, somewhere in the exact narrow space between those two things. The golden retriever does not flinch. She is sprawled on a fleece blanket the color of old straw, her head resting on her front legs, her tail moving once, slowly, like a second hand on a clock that is not in any hurry. She exhales. The Lynx Cub, 8 weeks old, 4.5 pounds of spotted fur and enormous tufted ears, lets its weight shift forward. The paw stays. The dog exhales again. Outside the window, the snow is coming down so hard you cannot see the tree line. It is minus 19 degrees Celsius. The wind has been blowing for 3 days without stopping. And inside a small animal rehabilitation center somewhere in the boreal forests of eastern Canada, a wild cat that should be dead, that should by every measure of biology and probability be frozen into the permafrost, is falling asleep against the side of a golden retriever named Ada. To understand what you are looking at, you have to understand what it means. Not emotionally, not yet. Biologically. A Canada lynx and a domestic dog are not supposed to touch. They are not supposed to be in the same room. The lynx is a solitary apex predator. It does not form bonds outside its species. It does not seek warmth from other animals. It does not lean into contact with creatures that are not its mother. Everything you know about wild cats, about their independence, their self-sufficiency, their almost architectural emotional distance, everything applies here. So how is this possible? To answer that, we have to go back. Not months, years, decades. We have to go back to a time when Canada's boreal forests began to empty of something most people didn't know was disappearing. Canada's boreal forest is the largest intact forest ecosystem on Earth. Let that land for a moment. 4 million square kilometers of spruce and fir and tamarack and black moss and frozen lake. Larger than the Amazon. Stretching from Newfoundland to the Yukon, from the northern edge of the Great Plains up into the subarctic. It is a world that exists largely outside human attention, which is partly why what has been happening inside it for the past 60 years has received so little of that attention. The Canada lynx once moved through this landscape like a ghost. Silent, wide-pawed, built for the deep snow that would swallow any other predator. Their feet are anatomical masterpieces, broad as snowshoes, furred beneath to grip the cold surface, each foot spreading under the animal's weight to distribute it across the snow so efficiently that a lynx can walk on top of a surface that would swallow a wolf to its shoulders. For thousands of years, they were everywhere. In the 1800s, Hudson's Bay Company trading records, some of the most meticulous wildlife data ever accidentally collected, documented lynx pelts being traded by the tens of thousands per year across the Canadian interior. One researcher, studying those records more than a century later, estimated that in peak years, more than 80,000 lynx moved through the boreal forest in a single breeding season. 80,000. Now, let that number sit. By the mid-20th century, the lynx had become a symbol of the fur trade's appetite. Their pelts, dense and silver gray and extraordinarily soft, were considered among the finest in the world. A single pelt in the 1970s could fetch the equivalent of several $100s today. Trappers pursued them across the boreal interior with a systematic efficiency that wildlife biologists would later describe as functionally indistinguishable from industrial harvesting. Trapping was legal. Trapping was regulated, at least on paper. In practice, the regulations were difficult to enforce in a forest where a single trapper might run a line spanning hundreds of kilometers of roadless wilderness. By the 1990s, lynx populations in parts of their historical range had collapsed so dramatically that in 2000, the United States Fish and Wildlife Service listed the Canada lynx as a threatened species under the Endangered Species Act. In Canada, the picture was more complicated, more contested, and in many regions, significantly worse. But the numbers obscure something the numbers cannot contain. A lynx mother raises her kittens alone. There is no pack, there is no pride, there is no extended family. There is only her. For weeks before the birth, she selects a den site with a precision that researchers can now track via GPS collars, but still barely understand. A fallen log, dense enough. A rocky overhang, south-facing enough to hold a degree or two of warmth. A tangle of roots, deep enough to hide the smell. She gives birth in May or June, usually to 2 or 3 kittens, occasionally 4. She nurses them for 5 months. She teaches them to hunt over the following year. She is their entire world. And when the trapper's wire catches her on a frozen November morning, 2 kilometers from where her kittens are sleeping, those kittens have approximately 48 hours before the cold takes them. 48 hours. Think about that. The cub that would eventually press its enormous paw against Ada's back was found in late January. Not May when kittens are born. January. Which means this cub was already months old when its mother disappeared. Which means it had survived weeks alone in the boreal forest at the coldest point of the year. Which means it had starved and huddled and tried and failed to hunt in conditions that would challenge an adult lynx in peak condition. A conservation officer responding to a report from a rural property owner found it in a woodpile, curled in the back, pressed against the warmest corner of the stacked logs. Too weak to run, not too weak to hiss. 4.5 pounds, the weight of a large house cat. Canada lynx at that age should weigh closer to 6, and this one was not that age, it was older, which means the weight loss was severe enough to be described in the intake report with a word that appears in veterinary documentation for animals in the final stage of starvation. Critical. Its core temperature was 32.8 degrees Celsius. Normal for a lynx is between 38 and 39. The difference between those numbers is the difference between alive and not. The rehabilitation worker who received the cub in her truck, driving 90 minutes on an ice road in the dark, said later that she held it against her chest the entire drive and talked to it, not because she thought it could understand her, but because she needed to hear a voice in the dark, and her voice was all she had. Stop and think about this. A wild cat that had survived alone in the boreal forest through temperatures that can reach -40, that had watched whatever happened to its mother happen to its mother, that had learned in those weeks what it means to be completely, cosmically alone, that was now being held against a stranger's chest on an ice road in the middle of the night. That is where this story begins. Not with a heartwarming scene, with a survival so narrow it barely qualifies as one. Wildlife rehabilitation facilities in the Canadian boreal region operate under a set of ethical constraints that most people never think about. The central tension is this. The goal is always return. The goal is to rehabilitate a wild animal and release it back into the wild. To do this successfully, you must not allow the animal to become habituated to humans. You must not allow it to lose its instinctive wariness. You must maintain enough behavioral wildness that when it goes back into the forest, it can function as the wild animal it is supposed to be. This means that with a lynx cub, especially a lynx cub in the condition this one arrived in, the primary intervention has to be medical first, warming second, feeding third, and all of it conducted with as little human contact as possible. Gloves, minimal handling, feeding from a distance where feasible. The protocol is not unkind. It is precisely the opposite of unkind. It is designed to give the animal its best chance at the life it deserves. But there is a problem that the protocol does not fully solve. One that wildlife rehabilitators know and quietly struggle with. One that the science has been documenting for decades, but that rarely makes it into the public conversation about animal conservation. The problem is this. A lynx cub in its first months of life is not just learning to hunt. It is undergoing a neurological development process that requires consistent social contact. Not human contact. Contact. The presence of a warm body. The pressure of physical proximity. The sound of another heartbeat. Dr. Temple Grandin, one of the foremost researchers in animal behavior and welfare in the world, has written extensively about what she calls the seeking system in mammals, the neurological architecture that drives animals to pursue warmth, contact, and social connection, not as a luxury, but as a biological necessity. In the absence of that contact, during critical developmental windows, the seeking system does not just go unsatisfied, it begins to malfunction. The research on wild felids raised in isolation shows results that are almost impossible to look at directly. Elevated cortisol levels that persist into adulthood, disrupted stress responses, difficulty regulating emotion, chronic hypervigilance that never fully resolves. In domestic cats, the damage is documented across dozens of studies. In wild cats, the research is smaller, but the findings are consistent. Isolation during early development leaves a wound that no amount of later socialization fully heals. Draw a line from those findings to a human experience, and you land with uncomfortable precision on what developmental psychologists call early attachment trauma. The same literature that describes what happens to children raised in orphanages without consistent caregivers. The same neurological disruption, the same elevated baselines, the same difficulty years later trusting the world. The cub in that rehabilitation facility was not just starving. It was living through the earliest stage of a wound that could last its entire life. Ada had been at the rehabilitation center for 4 years when the cub arrived. She had come as a puppy, surrendered by a family that had not understood what they were taking on with a working-line golden retriever. The kind bred not for the show ring, but for the field, built for 10-hour days and deep instinctual engagement with the world. The center's director, a woman named Marguerite, who had spent 30 years working in wildlife rehabilitation, had taken her in with a specific purpose. Facility dogs at rehabilitation centers serve a function that sounds simple and is anything but. They provide what the protocols prohibit humans from providing. They offer the presence of another warm body. They offer contact that doesn't carry the stamp of human habitation. To a wild animal, the smell of another animal, even a domestic one, is not the same signal as the smell of a human. It does not trigger the same behavioral caution. It does not imprint the same associations. A young deer that has spent time near a calm dog does not become a deer that seeks out humans. It becomes a deer that is slightly less likely to die of cardiovascular collapse from stress in the first weeks after release. The research on this, while still developing, points consistently in the same direction. The presence of a calm, well-socialized dog near recovering wildlife does not compromise wildness. In some documented cases, it appears to support it. Ada was exceptional at her job. In 4 years, she had shared space with recovering red foxes, a juvenile black bear, 2 great horned owls that had tolerated her presence with an indifference so total it bordered on contemptuous, a family of raccoons, and 1 extremely opinionated Canada goose that had, for reasons Marguerite still could not fully explain, formed what appeared to be a genuine friendship with Ada that lasted the entire 6 weeks of its rehabilitation. Marguerite had never introduced Ada to a lynx. The protocol, the careful, considered, ethically grounded protocol, did not call for it. And then it got cold. The temperature that week dropped to a point where even the facility's heated recovery spaces were struggling to maintain safe thermal environments for an animal in critical condition. The cub needed warmth. Not the warmth of a heat lamp, though it had that. Not the warmth of heated blankets, though it had those too. It needed the deep mammalian warmth of another body. Marguerite made the decision on a Thursday evening. She said later that she spent 40 minutes thinking about it, running through the protocols, weighing the risks. What if the dog startled the cub? What if the contact created habituation that compromised the release? What if Ada's presence introduced a stress variable into an animal already at the edge of what it could tolerate? She introduced them through a mesh barrier first. 30 minutes. Ada on one side, the cub on the other. What happened in those 30 minutes is the kind of thing that resists clinical description and rewards honest observation. The cub did not flee to the back of its enclosure. It came forward, not quickly, incrementally. A few inches, then still. A few inches more, then still. The nose working the mesh, reading a scent that was not prey, not predator, not human. Something else entirely. Something warm and calm and unremarkable in the most extraordinary way. Ada did not approach. She lay down 3 feet from the barrier, put her head on her front paws, and breathed. That is all she did. She breathed. And across the mesh, the cub with 4.5 pounds of body and the memory of something gone breathed too. Before I go further, I want to stop here for a moment, because this story is exactly the kind of story that this channel exists to tell. Not the dramatic rescues, not the spectacular wildlife footage, but the quiet ones. The ones that happen in small rooms in the middle of winter, in the middle of nowhere, where nobody is watching and nobody planned it, and the only witnesses are a woman who has spent 30 years learning to love animals without imposing that love on them, and a golden retriever who learned the same lesson without being taught. Stories like this one are disappearing. The facilities that make them possible run on funding that is always insufficient, on volunteers who work hours that exceed what any labor law would sanction, on donations that arrive in irregular trickles that never quite cover what needs covering. If you believe these stories matter, if you believe the wild world and the animals in it deserve a witness, subscribe to this channel, not as a transaction, as a statement. A statement that says the life of a lynx cub found in a woodpile at -19 degrees matters. That the quiet miracle of a dog lying down in the dark and simply breathing matters. These stories need to reach people who haven't found them yet. Help us get there, now. The mesh came down on a Saturday afternoon. What happened next unfolded over 11 weeks, and Marguerite documented it with the meticulous attention of someone who understood she was watching something that had no established precedent in the literature she had trained on. The first physical contact was not gentle. The cub reached through where the barrier had been and placed one enormous paw on Ida's left shoulder with what Marguerite described as the careful, testing pressure of an animal checking whether a surface will hold weight. Ida moved her ear. That was all. The paw stayed. 3 minutes, then it withdrew. The cub retreated to the far corner of the shared space and sat, watching. Ida did not follow. She did not look at the cub. She looked at the middle distance with the absolute serenity of an animal that has decided nothing happening in this room requires its active attention. The cub watched her for 20 minutes. Then it came back. This time it did not test. It simply pressed its side against Ida's ribs and stayed. Stop and think about this. A Canada lynx, one of the most solitary wild felids on the continent, an animal that in normal developmental circumstances would spend the rest of its life touching no creature except its own offspring, was pressing itself against a golden retriever because the need for warmth and contact was more powerful, more biological, more fundamental than every instinct pointing in the other direction. Science calls what happened next attachment behavior. The term is clinical, but the thing it describes is not. Over the following 3 weeks, the cub began to anticipate Ida's presence. It would position itself near the gate between their spaces before Marguerite opened it. When Ida entered, the cub's breathing, monitored via observational video, changed within 90 seconds. The rapid, shallow respiration of a vigilant wild animal slowed. The tufted ears, which in a stressed lynx stay rotated forward in a hard, listening posture, relaxed to a slight angle. The tail, which had spent weeks tucked in the protective curl of an animal that does not feel safe, began to assume the loose, unhurried position of an animal at rest. Ida, for her part, appeared to understand something that Marguerite had not trained her to understand. She adjusted her behavior around the cub with a precision that looked, from the outside, almost like deliberate accommodation. When the cub was eating, she moved to the far side of the space. When the cub was sleeping, she lay close but not touching, near enough to provide heat, far enough to leave the cub its wildness. She never initiated physical contact. She never pursued when the cub withdrew. She was, Marguerite said later, the most naturally skilled social animal she had encountered in 30 years. And she said it with the slightly bewildered expression of someone who knows the statement should require more qualification than it does. By week 6, they had developed a routine that Marguerite had not planned and could not have predicted. Every morning, when the facility's lights came on, the cub would move to where Ida slept and lie down against her back, not touching at first, then touching. The lynx's spotted coat and the dog's golden fur pressed together at the spine. They would stay like that for somewhere between 20 and 40 minutes. The cub's eyes would close. Ida's tail would move once, very slowly. Then the cub would stand, shake itself with the precise, fastidious motion of a cat that has woken from sleep and is reclaiming its dignity, and move to its food station. Marguerite called it the morning ritual. Her volunteers called it various things, all of them unprofessional, all of them accurate. What it was, clinically, was a co-regulation sequence. Two nervous systems borrowing each other's calm, a concept documented in human attachment theory, in the literature on trauma therapy, in studies of paired housing in captive mammals. The presence of a regulated nervous system adjacent to an unregulated one tends, over time, to regulate the second one. This is why trauma therapists sometimes use dogs in sessions. This is why human infants in close physical contact with calm caregivers show measurably different cortisol profiles than infants left in cribs. The cub was doing, by instinct and necessity, what every mammal's neurology is built to do. It was borrowing Ida's calm and slowly, incrementally, making it its own. But week 7 brought something that stopped Marguerite's documentation cold and made her sit at her desk for an hour before she could write what she had seen. The cub played. Lynx cubs in the wild play. They play with siblings. They play with their mother's tail. They play with snow. Play in wild felid kittens is not recreation. It is the rehearsal of survival, the neuromuscular practice of ambush, of pounce, of the precise sequence of movement that will one day bring down a snowshoe hare. A lynx cub in rehabilitation, alone, without siblings, without its mother, will sometimes play with enrichment objects. Balls, feathers on strings, crinkle toys that trigger the auditory stimulus of prey movement. What it does not do, according to every behavioral source Marguerite had ever consulted, is initiate play with a dog. On a Tuesday morning in week 7, the lynx cub crouched behind Ida and pounced on her tail. Ida lifted her head. The cub froze in the primal freeze of a cat that has committed to an action and is now evaluating the consequences. Ida looked at her tail. She looked at the cub. She looked at her tail again. She thumped it once against the floor. The cub pounced again. Ida tolerated 7 more pounces before she stood up, turned around, and pressed her nose to the cub's forehead with a gentleness so deliberate it silenced everyone in the room. Marguerite documented this in her records with the dry precision of a scientist trying to stay on the right side of anthropomorphism. She wrote, "Subject-initiated play behavior with facility dog at air weight 14. Behavior repeated 7 times. Dog response, non-aggressive, socially appropriate, appeared to encourage continuation." Then she closed her notebook and did not open it again for 20 minutes. By week 9, the vocabulary of their interaction had expanded to a degree that required a new set of descriptors. The cub had learned, apparently through some process of trial and negotiation with Ida, that the space directly behind Ida's right shoulder was the cub's space. Not the left shoulder, not the back. The right shoulder, specifically. Marguerite tried moving Ida's sleeping position to test whether the cub would follow the dog or follow the spot. The cub followed the dog. It walked past the old location without hesitation and arranged itself against Ida's right shoulder in the new position. The cub had not bonded with a place. It had bonded with a presence. At week 10, a volunteer named Theodore, a young man doing his master's thesis on rehabilitation protocols, was the first person outside the regular staff to witness the morning ritual. He described it in his thesis notes with a candor that his academic supervisor would later suggest he moderate before submission. He wrote, "I have spent 4 years studying animal behavior. I have read every major text. I have watched hundreds of hours of footage. I was not prepared for this. The cat needed the dog. That is the only way I can describe what I witnessed. Not in the way animals need food or heat or territory. In the way that beings need each other. I don't know what else to call it." In week 11, Marguerite got the news she had been waiting for and dreading. The cub, now weighing 6.5 pounds, which was still underweight but incomparably better than 4.5, had been assessed by the Provincial Wildlife Authority. The determination was that it could enter the pre-release preparation phase. This was, by every measure of Marguerite's professional mission, a success. The animal had survived. The animal was recovering. The animal would eventually go back to the forest it came from, back to the snowshoe hare territories of the boreal interior, back to the frozen landscape that was the only life it was ever meant to have. Marguerite understood this. She had understood it since the moment the cub arrived. The goal was always the forest. The goal was always freedom. But she also understood something that no protocol had ever been written to address, something that the literature she had trained on had not anticipated, because the situation it described had never, as far as anyone could determine, been documented in quite this form before. The cub had learned to need something. Not a human, not captivity, not the comfort of a domesticated existence. It had learned to need the presence of one specific warm body, one specific set of sounds and smells and rhythms, one specific golden-furred nervous system whose calmness it had spent 11 weeks borrowing, and in 4 weeks, that would be gone. Marguerite began the separation protocol on a Monday. Standard procedure: reduce shared time by 20% per week, replace with enrichment, with outdoor exposure, with the gradual reintroduction of the behavioral wildcards that a lynx needs to function in its environment. The cub's reaction in the first 48 hours was documented with the same clinical precision Marguerite brought to everything, and it was one of the hardest things she had ever written. Elevated vocalizations, food refusal, persistent orientation toward the door through which Ida had always entered. A behavior she noted, in her careful way, as searching. The cub was looking for something. The cub knew something was gone. Stop and think about what that means. An animal that came into this facility already carrying the wound of one disappearance was now experiencing the early signals of another. The cortisol data, collected via non-invasive fecal samples, showed an elevation of 37% in the first week of separation. 37%. Marguerite had seen similar numbers in animals entering the facility in acute distress. She modified the protocol. Instead of hard separation, she moved to scent-based maintenance. Ida's bedding placed near the cub's resting area. Not the dog herself, just the presence of her smell. Recorded audio of Ida's breathing played at low volume during the cub's rest periods. It was, Marguerite said later, the strangest thing she had ever done in 30 years. And it worked. Not completely, not without cost, but enough. The cortisol came down. The food refusal resolved. The searching behavior decreased in frequency, though it did not disappear entirely. The cub was released in late April, when the snow had softened enough for a young lynx to begin learning the terrain on its own terms. The release site was 40 kilometers from where it had been found, chosen for its snowshoe hair density and its distance from active trapping routes. Marguerite and 2 volunteers drove it in a transport crate in the back of a pickup truck on a dirt road that had only recently become passable. The cub was silent the entire drive. When Marguerite opened the crate at the release point, the lynx did not move for 2 minutes. It sat at the lip of the crate opening and read the air, the smell of spruce sap, the smell of thaw, the smell of everything it was built to inhabit. Then it stepped out onto the snow, took 4 steps, and stopped, looked back. Marguerite, who had been documenting this in her notes, stopped writing. She said later she was not sure what she was looking at, whether the cub was looking at her, at the truck, at some point beyond both, whether it was hesitating, whether it was something else. Then the cub turned back to the forest and walked, and within 11 steps it was invisible. The boreal swallowed it so completely and so immediately that it was as if it had never been in the crate, never been in the facility, never been in Marguerite's woodpile, never pressed its enormous paw against the back of a golden retriever named Ida on a Thursday evening in January. Marguerite stood at the edge of the tree line for a while. The snow was melting into the moss. A whiskey jack called from somewhere in the spruce. She drove back to the facility where Ida was waiting by the door. She spent a long time sitting on the floor with the dog, not doing anything in particular, just sitting. The cub was monitored via a GPS collar for 8 months. The data from those months is, in the dry language of wildlife tracking, unremarkable. Consistent movement patterns consistent with normal lynx ranging behavior. Evidence of successful hunting, cached prey, feeding sites, the biological indicators that a lynx is doing what a lynx is supposed to do. At month 5, the collar registered what researchers identified as denning behavior in an area with multiple snowshoe hair tracks. At month 8, the collar signal was lost, which is standard. Collars fall off. Animals move out of range. The absence of signal is not evidence of absence. Marguerite filed the loss of signal report with the Provincial Wildlife Authority and noted in her comments section, which was not required and which she filled in anyway, that the animal had demonstrated full behavioral wildness throughout the monitoring period, and that based on the available data, there was no reason to conclude anything other than that it had successfully integrated into its habitat. She did not write what she said to Theodore, her volunteer, at the end of their last conversation about the cub. She said, "I think it's okay. I think it knows how to be alone now." There is a weight to those words that only makes sense if you know what the cub came from. What alone meant before the woodpile. What alone meant in the facility before Ida. What alone means now, in a forest where every instinct the cub carried is finally in its right environment, finally serving its right purpose, finally aligned with the life it was built to live. The wound is not gone. The science is clear that early developmental trauma in mammals does not simply resolve. The cortisol baselines stay elevated longer. The stress response stays slightly sharper. But the animal learned, in 11 weeks in a room in the middle of winter, something that no protocol designed it to learn. It learned that contact is survivable, that warmth does not always precede loss, that it is possible to be held briefly and then released and still be whole. That is not a small thing to have learned. Ida is still at the rehabilitation center. She is 9 years old now, which is middle-aged for a golden retriever, and she moves with the deliberate ease of an animal that has figured out how to distribute its energy across the full length of a day. She has since shared space with 2 more lynx cubs, a marten, a fisher cat, and a juvenile wolverine that tested her patience in ways the lynx never did. She approaches each new animal the same way she approached the cub that first night. She lies down. She breathes. She offers her calm like a gift that costs her nothing and means everything. Marguerite says she sometimes watches Ida in those first encounters and thinks about what it takes to be that kind of presence for another creature. To bring no agenda, to require nothing, to simply be there steadily, without performance or expectation, until the frightened thing in front of you decides the world might be survivable after all. She says she has tried to be that for the animals she works with. She is not sure she always succeeds. She is sure Ida does. There is a thing that happens sometimes when you spend enough time at the edge of the wild world, when you spend enough time with animals that have survived things that should have killed them, with animals that have formed bonds that no behavioral textbook predicted, with animals that have chosen against every biological imperative to trust one more time. There is a thing that happens where the line between what the animal is experiencing and what you are experiencing becomes very difficult to find. Not because you are projecting, not because you are anthropomorphizing, but because the things that matter most, warmth, contact, the presence of a calm body in a cold room, the choice to stay, the willingness to be held, these are not uniquely human things. They are not even primarily human things. They are mammalian things. They are ancient. They are in the architecture of every nervous system that has ever tried to survive something. What the lynx cub learned in those 11 weeks was not a lesson about dogs, or about humans, or about the facility that held it. It learned what every creature that has ever been truly alone eventually has to learn. That the capacity to need does not make you weak. That the willingness to accept warmth does not make you less wild. That the bond, when it comes and when it ends, was real. The forest is still there. The spruce sap is still rising in April. The snowshoe hare is still moving through the boreal in its cycles of abundance and collapse that have defined this ecosystem for 10,000 years. Somewhere in that forest, in a territory that is exactly as large and exactly as cold as it needs to be, a Canada lynx with slightly elevated cortisol baselines and the neuromuscular memory of 11 weeks against a golden retriever's ribs is doing what it was always supposed to do. It is hunting in the dark. It is reading the air. It is alive. And if you found something in this story, if something in the image of a 4.5-pound wild cat pressing its uncertain paw against the back of a dog that did not flinch, If something in that image landed somewhere in you that recognizes what it feels like to need warmth in a cold room and be afraid of what needing it means, then you already understand what this story is really about. It is not about a lynx. It is not about a dog. It is about the particular courage it takes to accept comfort. The particular difficulty of letting another creature close enough to help. The way that every being, across every species, across every divide of biology and instinct and evolutionary history, sometimes finds itself at the edge of what it can survive alone. And sometimes, in the exact right moment, something warm lies down nearby and breathes and does not ask for anything. And that turns out to be enough. If this story reached something in you, leave a word below. Tell us what you felt. These stories travel through the people who carry them, and the world needs more people carrying this one. Subscribe if you want to be here when the next one comes. Share it if you know someone who needs to be reminded that the wild world is still full of this. We will see you in the next one. Now, go back to the beginning. A paw the size of a dinner plate landing on the back of a golden retriever. The question in its weight. The answer in the dog's exhale. The snow coming down outside. -19 degrees. And the particular impossible warmth of two creatures choosing, without language, without plan, without any evolutionary reason in the world, to be alive together in a small room in the dark.